Okay, our next podcast is going to look at what's a continuation of plant diversity. We've talked about the bryophytes, and we are now going to look at, and we've talked about the vascular seedless plants that include the ferns and club mosses. We are now going to look at the most complex in the plant kingdom, and that is the seed plants. Seed plants are usually divided into two groups. We're also going to move on into fungi in this podcast as well. But the seed plants are the most complex plant. The seed, as shown here, is basically an embryo and surrounding nutrients that are surrounded by a protective coat. The embryo is, and so this allows the plant to survive in dry conditions. Now in this, we still alternate between different generations in the plant. This shows a chart here comparing the different plant groups. So here's our seed plants, and there's two major types. We're going to look at each one, both the gametophytes, or rather the gymnosperms. The gametophyte is one of the generations, and then the sporophyte is the other. And the sporophyte is the dominant generation. Here's the ferns that we talked about, where the gametophyte was the lesser of the generation of the sporophytes, the dominant. Here, the gametophyte in our mosses and other non-vascular plants, and sporophyte was a short portion of the life cycle. But the seed plants include both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And they're basically, the seed plants are found just about everywhere because of the seed and also the pollen grain, which makes for transfer of gametes through the air possible, either the air or via insects, pollinators. But yeah, they are found basically everywhere, terrestrial and even in some swampy kind of habitats and desert habitats. So pretty much everywhere we find the seed plants. And we can start by looking at the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms, this diagram shows a gymnosperm, which includes the pines, also ginkgos. So the pines are conifers. There's a large group conifers that pines are included in, and the cicades. But this shows a pine, a female cone here, and there are, on the female cone are these scales, and they each carry an egg in here. So here is our ovule or egg, and then the pollen is carried, the sperm is carried by the pollen, and it's transferred, and where it fertilizes the egg, where it has a haploid cell, the sperm carried by the pollen grain is haploid. They unite and form a diploid embryo, and that's going to grow into our new sporophyte. So that's the production or the fertilization that occurs after pollination. The transfer of the pollen here is called pollination. And we can follow this. Let's look at a typical gymnosperm, the pine tree. So there's two different types of cone in the gymnosperms. There's male and female cone. The male cone are the small structures that are on the pine tree that produce the pollen. The female cone is the large cone, is the ovulate cone or female cone, where the eggs and then the pollen is carried to the female cone. Usually this is in gymnosperms just by wind and air. Sometimes insects or pollinators will help, but generally this is. And you can see that when the pine trees are releasing their pollen, the pollen is just basically everywhere. And so some of those will actually pollinate um, other cones. All right, and so once that occurs, once we have fertilization of the egg, then it starts to grow and develops into the young sporophyte that will then can be released from the pine cone, and those are going to be the seeds that come from that fertilization will be the seeds where the seedling can grow. So that's the gymnosperms, and the next thing that we can look at is the angiosperms. Angiosperms are the flowering plants, and the flowering plants are the most complex of the seed plants, and they use primarily insects to transfer their pollen. All right, so they're hermaphroditic, meaning that they have both male and female, just like the gymnosperms have both male and female structures on the same individual. And the reproductive structure of the angiosperm is the flower. So these are the flowering plants. Has a male structure. So again, the male structure is the anther. The female structure is the carpel right here. And so reproduction occurs by the pollen coming in contact and being transferred. Let's get to this next slide. Yeah, pollen being transferred right here to the stigma, which is the tip part here of the female structure, and then that pollen travels down the style to where the eggs are down here in the carpel. And so fertilization will take place there and then develop into our seed and the embryo. The embryo is the seed. And then it can, once it starts growing, that's called germination. All right, so that's the flowering plants, and the most complex of the seed plants. Let's see. And we're going to go ahead in this podcast and start looking at the fungi as well. Now, fungi are a different group. They're in a separate kingdom. They have their own kingdom. At one time, they were grouped in with the plants. They have some similarities to their structure as plants, but when you look at their cells are quite different. They are not photosynthetic, for one thing, which is a requirement to be a plant. It has to be photosynthetic, able to make its own food. Fungi do not do that. They are heterotrophic. They have to intake food from outside their bodies, and so in that respect, they are more like animals than they are like plants. But they are heterotrophic. Their cell walls do not have cellulose like plants, but they have chitin in their cell walls. So another major difference. These are important decomposers in the ecosystem. They help to break down dead and decaying material and release nutrients for other organisms like plants. Here we see the basic structure of fungi here. They are made up of these string-like structures called hyphae. They weave together to make a network, and that whole network is called a mycelium. Now here the mushroom, which is a common type of fungi, the mushroom itself is just a reproductive structure that it produces at certain times in its life to release spores. And so that is, but the thread-like structures are found in all different types of fungi. The mycelium is the mass of these thread-like structures. Right here is an example of a type of fungus called a mycelium, or no, a mycorrhizae. This is mycorrhizae are these fungi that attach to the roots of vascular plants, and they actually help the vascular plants to absorb nutrients. So they're referred to as having a symbiotic relationship with the plants. Reproduction in fungi can vary significantly, but there is generally a asexual form of reproduction. Their spores are released that can grow into that mycelium we talked about, and the mycelium can come together or fuse together. Cells of that mycelia can fuse in a process called karyogamy, and that's a sexual form of reproduction. Now, examples are the grouping of fungi can get kind of diverse, but really there's four major types of fungi, or four major divisions that we can put fungi in. One is the ascomycetes, and these are all defined by having this sac-like structure called an ascocarp. Here's a couple of examples of those. And then we have the basidiomycetes. The basidiomycetes includes the mushrooms that you're familiar with, also these puffballs and the bracket fungi, so some various types there. And then we have an example of a zygomycete here. This is one called Pilobolus. But zygomycetes, they're very diverse, and they have types of sporangia called zygosporangia. There's a number of different types of molds, bread molds, and things that would fall into this group. And the last one we mentioned there is chytridiomycetes. This is a fresh water, an aquatic type of fungi. They're mainly found in fresh water. They're important decomposers, but these are chytridiomycetes. The last thing we mentioned here is something about their different modes of nutrition. Some fungi are parasitic in nature, and some are actually capture their own food, so there's a lot of variation with the way they can obtain their food. We also mentioned in the outline fairy rings. This is the form of reproduction that the mycelia, which grows underground, the outer portion of the ring is where the fruiting bodies will be delivered. So you can see this ring around here. The mycelium is the whole structure under the ground. Again, these fruiting bodies just come up when it gets ready to produce spores along the outside, forming a ring. Those are called fairy rings. And the last thing we mentioned here are another symbiotic relationship. We mentioned the mycorrhizae. Another one is called lichen. That lichen is actually a composite organism between an algae and a lichen. And you can see that here. You may be familiar with the look of this bottom one down here. These are found on dead and decaying limbs, on the bark of trees, pretty common. And it looks like one organism, some kind of plant-like thing, but it's actually two organisms together. You can see that in this diagram. The algae kind of get interwoven in the hyphal strings here of the fungi. And you can see that in this electron microscopic view. So we call that a composite organism because it's really two organisms that work together. Pathogenic. This shows there are some that are pathogenic, and there are some that are antibiotic, meaning that they repel bacteria. And you can see that in the penicillium that's growing on this plate, and then the staphylococcus here. It does not grow near the penicillium, and so we use that. That's a very common antibiotic that we use. Alexander Fleming was the first to discover that. And that's where we end for our discussion. So we got the seed plants and the fungi in there. We still have animals to go through in future podcasts.